Tonight we are very privileged to have Dr. Joseph Kezele with us. And I wrote kind of your bio and the little flyer that went out to everybody, so I hope everybody's familiar enough with it because I don't have it in front of me. But he's a very impressive guy, and he's done a lot of stuff. And he is now teaching at the Arizona Christian University. And please welcome Dr. Joseph Kezele.
Thank you, Jim, very much for having me back. This is about the fifth or sixth time I've been back here. I love it every time I come. My wife, Patty, is from Northern California, and so she loves to come back here, and she's a beach person. And I'm a desert rat. I was born in the desert in Arizona, but it's always great to come here and enjoy what you have here to offer. It's also very nice that the announcement was made about the trip to the Grand Canyon. Being a native Arizonan, I've been to the canyon many, many, many times. And we've had the joy of taking many people there, either from out of state or from out of country, for their first encounter with the Grand Canyon. And one thing we always enjoy doing is have them keep their eyes closed, and we lead them up. They have to be very trusting. We lead them up to the edge there, and then have them open their eyes when they're right there, and when they see it, and it's staring them in the face, and usually they're pretty speechless. It's amazing. So if you have a chance to go and you've never been, do go. And with having the advantage of having Bill Hosch and Dr. Baumgartner there to give you the creation biblical model perspective, it'll be a fantastic experience. And then what you're going to want to do is, after you experience the Grand Canyon on the rim, you're going to want to go back and you're going to want to raft the Colorado through the canyon with Tom Vail, who runs Canyon Ministries. And he has a biblically based tour through the canyon on the rafts, and so you hear about the geology literally from the bottom up, to make a pun there. So it's great experiences to do. Tonight I'm doing this talk, a natural selection and speciation, having fun with dogs, and it's one of my least technical talks. It's more fun, more just for a general audience, but I do have some technical dessert for you at the end if you're wanting to have it, with an extra short presentation if you're up for it, that's tightly related to this. I want to start out with some scripture here from Job 12, 7 and 8. But now ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. So he's talking about the beasts explaining to us. This is God talking to Job. So we have a particular beast, a dog. And so you see here the announcer saying, and now, can dogs really talk? We found one who's willing to try, right after this message. And maybe you can see back there that the dog is actually reading the book while he's waiting to be brought on stage there. So we're going to see what the dog has to say to us. We're going to start out with this concept that species do not equal biblical kind, that they are two separate concepts. And I want to start out here with giving you this definition of species. In zoology, a collection of organized beings derived from one common parentage by natural generation, characterized by one peculiar form, liable to vary from the influence of circumstances only within certain narrow limits. Now, I think this is a pretty good definition of species. Now, I would like to see if any of you can have a clue as to when this definition was written. Anybody want to stab? Make a guess. I heard 18 what? Say that again?
58.
1858. You're quite close. How about 1828? And that was the very first edition of Webster's Dictionary. I think that's pretty impressive, because you know what they had in the way of technology back then? A pretty rudimentary microscope, and that was it. So that's astounding. That this is excellent, because it talks about this limitation to the degree of variation, and it says within certain narrow limits, within a kind. Well, so that's why you don't get this type of thing happening. There's something funny about this kid, because obviously you're having two different kinds that will not mix genetically. So we're talking about variation within a kind. And we have modern evidence of this. So here you see when you have a union of a lion and a tiger, you get these things, depending upon which one is the male, either a liger or a tigon. And so this happens in zoos, and it's not through artificial insemination. And these are actually quite large. These are just cubs here. So this is showing that you can get this combination of different species within a kind, a biblical kind. Not only the cat kind, but here we have the bear kind with polar bears and with the brown bear. And in Canada, in the wild, was found this particular specimen. Unfortunately, the hunter didn't realize that before he shot the beast at a distance. But a natural union there, not in a zoo. And in Genesis 1:25, and God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So here is one of many times that this concept of kind is laid out in Scripture. And this has to be the basis of our thinking in every area, as well as in this area as well, so that when we start with the biblical concept, then we can properly interpret the science, interpret the evidence that we have in front of us in the present time. So let's take a look at a little bit of some crucial biblical history here. Going on to chapter 6 of Genesis, of the birds after their kind, animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, two of every kind, will come to you to keep them alive. So here they're boarding on the ark, and the dogs are saying, check the papers, they're probably forged. They'll scratch the furniture and they'll transmit ringworm. All right? So, did every species need to be on the ark? No. And here we have an example from the horse kind. There's the verse again, and it shows that these are various species and the offspring of combination of different species within the horse kind. So you get such things such as zebrula or zorses, depending upon where the work was done and how they were named, or zonkey. Okay, so these are offspring from these unions, showing that these are all within the horse kind. So there only needed to be 2 horses on the ark, such as only 2 dogs or 2 cats, with a wide range of genes, with the different characteristics from very small to very large, white to very dark fur, very short to long fur, etc. So along comes the flood, and we have Genesis 8:19. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families or kind, went out of the ark after the flood. And so here is a very old Belgian tapestry. It goes back to the 1500s. And here it's showing the 2 cat kind coming off, 2 dog kind coming off, 2 horse kind, and some various other critters there. So now with the 2 dogs coming off, we start getting variation within a kind after the flood. And this is what we're going to be talking about as we go along this evening. Well, then after they get off the ark, in Genesis 9:1, God says, so God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, did they obey? They did not. They didn't fill the earth. They stayed where? Babel. They stayed at Babel. They disobeyed God. They didn't fill the earth. They stayed right there and concentrated and said they were going to build a city and not honor God, but instead worship the creation, not the creator. So here in Genesis 9:7, God repeats the command, and as for you, be fruitful, multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply in it. Well, the animals only had to be told once. They listened, they obeyed, unlike man. And so you have the pair of dogs here coming off the ark, and they start multiplying, and so on, and multiplying, and multiplying. And then finally, what did they do after that? They started spreading out, migrating, and developing various isolated groups that would have subsets of the gene pool, that certain individuals would have various combinations of genes. And so that is how speciation would begin, would be with migration, isolation, and differentiation within the gene pool as they spread out and took off. So let's get back to this business of species not equaling biblical kind. And I just want to give you this visual panorama of the 34 different species within the dog kind that we have today. That number was 35 until in this last decade, and they reduced it to 34 by combining the gray wolf and the domestic dog into one species, because through genetic studies they realized that the domestic dogs came out of the gray wolf. And so now there are only 34 species rather than 35. So here you see some very interesting characters with some rather odd combinations of characteristics. It's like the stripes on the aardwolf or the very short legs on the bush dog. I'm not sure I care for the dietary choice of the Blandford's fox there. It's eating this giant praying mantis type critter. Crunch, crunch. The coyote we're familiar with very much in Arizona. I imagine you have quite a few of them here in Southern California as well. They adapt very well to the urbanization of the desert, and we have them around our house all the time. The very large ears on the fennec fox, they're native to northern Africa, the Sahara. These guys are from different parts of the world, as you can tell from the names, like the Tibetan sand fox, Ethiopian wolf, the Falkland Islands fox, Arctic fox, so they're spread out. Dingo is native to Australia. I would not want to meet up with that Iberian wolf in the dark alley. That is one mean-looking critter. The Szechuan zorro, for those of you who know Spanish, know that zorro means fox in Spanish, being within the dog kind. So the character in the movies, he's a fox. Yeah. All right. The raccoon dog, how do you like that one? Isn't that wild? And then on the other hand, the maned wolf has an incredibly long legs. It's almost like it's on stilts. We have those in the Phoenix Zoo. And then the one called Hory Zorro has that white frosting on the end of its hair, natural, not the trip to the beauty salon. The word hoary refers to like a frosting. And then Mexican gray wolf is in the news all the time in Arizona with the federal program to reintroduce it to the area, to reestablish some ecological balance with the other critters. And then we have here this quote here from Science, a very secular journal. The origin of the domestic dog from wolves has been established. We examined the mitochondrial DNA, that's DNA that exists only within the mitochondria, the little organelles that are the power plants of the cells. It's separate from the DNA in the nucleus. The sequence of variation among 654 domestic dogs representing all major dog populations worldwide, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. Isn't it nice how this statement is very confirmatory of the biblical account here? And then here's another part of the definition in Webster's, the more modern web online dictionary. Category of biological classification designated by a binomial, meaning binomial two names, that consists of the name of a genus followed by a Latin or Latinized, uncapitalized noun or adjective agreeing grammatically with the genus name. So genus and species is the binomial name. And for those of us who've been out of school for a while, they keep changing the classification system from when Linnaeus started it about 250 years ago. And the thing that's new is the domain on top of kingdom. For those, that was new to me as I started teaching more stuff here. And a way to remember all this is very simple. It's a great question to ask yourself. And that question is, do king penguins congregate on frozen ground sometimes? And the answer is yes, they do. Those of you who saw March of the Penguins, great movie. So that's how you can remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And in the case of the domestic dog, Canis familiaris, here we have that order of things. Eukaryotes means organisms that have membranes around the nuclei in the cells and membranes around the little organelles in the cells. Animalia, okay, obvious, animals. Chordata, meaning they have a spinal cord. Mammalia, mammals, things that animals, that have fur warm-blooded, mammary glands, give live birth for the most part. There's a couple exceptions. Those kinds of characteristics, have diaphragms, care for the young. And then carnivora, meat eaters, Canidae, the dog, Canis, canine, and then Canis, dog familiaris, domestic dog. So I just want to look at a few of these because they're really fun in terms of the meaning of these names. Otocyon megalotus means ear dog, big ear. Ear dog, big ear. And that being the bat-eared fox. And you'd say, yes, that's appropriately named, right? Another one is Dusicyon vetulus, and that means old foolish dog, and that's that hori zorro, because it's frosted and old and looks kind of gray there, all right? And another one is vulpus vulpus. Well, that's fox fox, using the Latin. And that's the red fox. That's a typical one that people picture when they're thinking of the fox hunts in England that they do. And that's going to be the subject of the add-on at the end. Then we have Canis lupus, which means what? Dog, wolf, or the gray wolf, the one from which dogs have speciated, domestic dogs. And then finally, Canis latrans, which means dog barking dog, and the coyote. And those of you who've heard coyotes say, yes, that's a very good description of those. And when we get to enjoy where we live, we get to enjoy hearing the packs of coyotes do just that frequently during the evenings. We even had the blessing of having 6 coyote pups come into our backyard there and hang around for several weeks until they grew too large to fit through the grating of the fence there. And so that was a treat. And then Canis familiaris, domestic dog, which has now been combined with the gray wolf. And we go to this and we say, what is going on here? You see this bull mastiff, right? Nearly the size of the horse. And then this to me is just simply an overgrown rat. Some people call it a dog, Chihuahua, but I have no use for them. Well, I do. We dissect things in my biology class, so that would be a use. So how does this happen, doggone it? And that is through breeding. So this is a deliberate disaster, as far as I'm concerned, because this is artificial selection. People decided to do this on purpose. And then yet here we have, look at this horse. Isn't that amazing? That is one small horse. Keep this in mind when we get to the tail end of the add-on section. So that's what we're going to talk about now is artificial selection. Artificial selection. So how do you get to the degeneration of a Chihuahua? All right. Let's take a look here. We have the combination of genes from male and from female. And so we'll represent this particular characteristic that we're going to talk about here in terms of size. So I've shown you the huge bull mastiff and the Chihuahua. And so if all capital letters are used to represent the genes that combine for large skeleton size, and on the other extreme, the only small lowercase letters to represent a very small skeleton size, and then these combinations of genes in between that give varying grades, varying degrees of medium, from large medium to medium to small medium, then you can see how we get this full range of selection, so that when those two beasts were on the ark of each kind, they would have the full range of the genes in each of the male and female animals, and then from those containing all of that information, with time through sexual reproduction, there's a shuffling of the genes, and you get these various combinations from the very large to the very small and the wide range in between. In this case, we're just talking about the characteristics of large and small skeleton size, but this applies to all the different characteristics that the genes code for. So that's how you get this degeneration to Chihuahua, through deliberate selection, artificial selection of genes for small skeleton size. But the major take-home point here is this is through loss of information. The loss of information for large skeleton size in this case, or for long hair, since they have very short hair, is how speciation occurs. It's through loss of information, not through gain of information, which is what evolution calls for. It calls for gain of information, through, usually they say through mutation. But as a physician, the only things I ever experienced through mutations in people was death and disease. Never any improvement whatsoever. I saw a lot of people with different diseases due to mutations. So mutations cause loss of information, death and disease, not an addition of information. And then for every year, for hundreds of tourists traveling great distances to get a glimpse of the few remaining mountain chihuahuas. All right, so this is Gary Larson. He's got a very twisted sense of humor. Sometimes I even understand it. And so I love to use his stuff. Let's take a look at natural selection to make a point here. And so we have animals in the self-help section. Hibernate the easy way, become one of the herd. How to avoid natural selection. Do it by instinct, predator-prey relationships, and then dare to be nocturnal. All right. Well, natural selection, a process that results in the survival and reproductive success of individuals or groups best adjusted to their environment, and that leads to the perpetuation of genetic qualities best suited to that particular environment. That's a reasonable thought, but we have to be very careful, because when the evolutionists talk about natural selection, they're empowering the environment to choose which animals survive, depending upon the characteristics of the animal for the particular environment that they are in. But that's got the cart before the horse. It's backwards. And I'm going to make this point a little later on about how we really ought to be thinking of it and actually using a different phrase than natural selection. And this phrase, and this is Webster's, and this phrase is programmed filling. And I wish I could take credit for coming up with this phrase, but I can't say that. Randy Galeuzzi, any of you know him or heard of him? Randy Galeuzzi with ICR, Institute for Creation Research, formerly of Santee down in the San Diego area. Now they're based in Dallas. And he came up with this phrase, programmed filling. And what he's saying is that God programmed the genetic information into the genomes of all living organisms with that full range of information, so that when these plants or animals, or even bacteria and fungi, came into contact with different environments that developed after the flood, they had the information that would be shuffled by a reproduction, and then the organisms that have the best combination for a particular circumstance, a particular environment, were the ones that would succeed and do well. So he's saying the way to really think about this is it's programmed filling through design by the creator, putting the information into the genomes, and then the animals that have the best combination information then do best, or in the plants as well, do best in the various environments that develop after the flood. That's the whole key message of this whole evening right there. Now here I show you the gray wolf coming off the ark, and then through migration, isolation, and shuffling of genes, then develop these various numbers of species that we see today. And so we're going to investigate why this happened, what are the forces behind this happening. But I just want to talk a little bit more about this business of the shuffling of genes. So here you see that representation of the Belgian tapestry of the animals coming off the ark. And so you see the two dogs that have the dog kind, the wolves, that have the combination of genes, the wide range of genes in their genomes, represented in this simple example illustration by having both long and short fur length genes. And so as they reproduce, what's going to happen is 25% of the offspring will have short fur, 50% will have medium fur, and another 25% will have long fur. So the two on the ends that with just the short and just long hair only have the genes for short and long fur. Each of those have lost the genes for the other part of that characteristic, and so that is how loss of information then would lead to, for example, the ones with long fur, when they reproduce, only being able to produce offspring with long fur because of loss of information for the short fur gene. All right. using the same concept, just going over this again, in this case, talking about what genes from the male and from the female. Instead of talking about skeleton size, now we're going to talk about fur color. And so you see only dark fur represented by the capital letters and the lowercase letters representing only light colored or white fur, such as in the Arctic fox there. And all these ranges in between of medium colored furs or a combination of fur colors. And so again, that's how you get all of these various combinations from just the two beasts who came off the ark. So using fur length, you think about the ones that are going to do best and reproduce the best in the cold, snowy ice climate of the Arctic North is going to be the Arctic fox, right? And the one that's going to do best in the hot equatorial zones of Africa, where camouflage is useful and where shorter fur is better for the heat there, is the African wild dog. So you can see how speciation occurs from this wide range of genetic material in the genome of the beast, and then with the shuffling of the genes, the ones that do better in the different environments are the ones who multiply most in those environments because of that programmed filling. So here I want to give you an example of natural selection from the evolutionist point of view. So, do you think that one's going to make offspring and multiply? Don't think so. Okay. So, the question is, why would speciation occur after the flood? So let's take a look at this. What would be the driving force for all this happening? We'll go back to Genesis again. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So from this, people make conclusions that if there was not rain, that things were not riled up in terms of weather. Things were pretty calm and uniform. And since everything was created in the beginning for the garden to be ideal and to be very comfortable and for people to be able to live without clothing, that it was most likely a subtropical type climate around the entire planet, since the command was to multiply and fill the entire planet, before sin occurred and there was the need for clothing. So the thought is that there's the documentation of no clothing initially. So the thought is that then that the whole world was the subtropical, very comfortable climate, probably not high mountains because that would be cold up in the altitude, and that it's even thought that maybe the reverse ratio of the surface area of land to water. Today it's 75% water, 25% land surface on the planet, and it's thinking maybe it's just the opposite of that prior to the flood, and that the earth very well could have easily supported many billions prior to the flood. And even in that short time period of 1,656 years from the creation week to the time of the flood would have been plenty of time, because people lived very long lives and could easily have many children for each couple, and have multiple generations alive at the same time. And so here we have documentation of those long age lengths prior to the flood, except for Enoch, because he was taken up directly into heaven, did not die at that time, as opposed to what happens after the flood. And so the thought is, in this pre-flood atmosphere, that there was much more oxygen in the atmosphere prior to the flood, because today, in the sedimentary layers of rock laid down, there's a tremendous amount of oxygen as well as carbon locked up in rock, in limestone, for example, carbonates, or carbon and hydrogen and even oxygen locked up in oil and under the ground, or carbon and hydrogen in natural gases. So there's lots of different minerals in the ground representing huge amounts of carbon and oxygen that would have been in the circulation of the biomass among the plants and the animals and the atmosphere in the pre-flood world. And with this greater amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air, that the air pressure may have very well been significantly higher as well. And that with that, it would be much easier for these very large flying reptiles to have the lift that they needed to be able to fly in the pre-flood atmosphere. Engineers say that they don't think that the present atmosphere would support the weight of these size flying critters, but that with a denser, heavier atmosphere, that very well could be the case. And we know all about the situation where we've all heard about where the engineers say the bumblebee ought not to be flying according to their calculations of its design, yet it flies quite well. And we know that there's a lot of gigantism in the fossil record, including just the example of this dragonfly fossil representation, where the fossils of dragonflies have been found that are 3 feet wide. It's quite a wingspan, all right? And so suspect that there's more lift in the atmosphere in the pre-flood world. And you can see here for scale that some of these flying critters were huge, the size of giraffes. So the suspicion is that there was a lot more oxygen. And this is borne out because we treat several diseases today with these hyperbaric chambers. These high 100% oxygen chambers are taken up to 3 times the normal air pressure at sea level, 3 atmospheres pressure. And then these cure infectious diseases. And this may be another reason why people live so much longer prior to the flood. Also, another reason would be people at that time not having the very heavy burden of mutations in the genome that we carry today. But that's a whole nother discussion. So then, all of the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. And here's a representation from Walt Brown's book, In the Beginning, showing that the water that was trapped in the crust prior to the flood was under extreme high pressure, and then when that pressure was finally relieved, the water shot up greatly high into the atmosphere and did a lot of eroding of the margins, leading to the creation of these miles thick layers of various sedimentary deposits that we have laid down by the flood. And then after the whole thing was over, people came off the ark, and what I really like is the detail that this artist gave, because if you look in the foreground there in front of their feet, he's showing marine fossils. And they're on Ararat, they're up in high altitude. And you know that's very accurate, because we know that today we find marine fossils even in the Himalayas at the peaks of all these high mountains, the Alps, the Rockies, what am I trying to say in South America? Thank you, Andes. And so we know that those fossils did not crawl up there, climb up there. They were laid down during the flood, before the mountains were thrust up in the latter stages of the flood process, the flood year. And so we see this great decline in the lifetimes of the patriarchs after the flood. So there's a lot of dramatic changes that went on due to the flood. I don't think we have any appreciation to any appropriate degree as to everything that went on during the flood process and how violent it was, and the many things that were changed dramatically. We know today we have a residual of the flood in the form of this ring of fire around the Pacific, and you guys feel the earthquakes every once in a while. The volcanoes that are happening, experienced more in the northern part of the coast of the Americas, and a lot of still settling of the earth from the time of the flood. Things are still adjusting. And not only do we have, as we see today, the volcanoes that are above sea level, but there were volcanoes below sea level as well. And this is known because of the different type of lava that's laid down underwater than is laid down above water on land. And it's easy for the geologist to differentiate the two. And so with all this activity going on during the flood year, with the fountains of the Great Deep opening up, representing not only water coming up, but a lot of lava, because we find a lot of layers of lava between the sedimentary layers laid down by the flood. But part of this would be the tremendous amount of heat liberated by these underwater volcanoes, warming up the oceans greatly, significantly, so that would cause a tremendous amount of evaporation from the oceans. And then the above water level volcanoes, liberating tremendous amounts of ash, which would be blocking sunlight. So you have a combination of these factors of warm oceans evaporating tremendous amounts of water into the atmosphere, very warm, humid air. Cold land masses, they've been stripped bare of vegetation. There's a lot of ash, a lot of clouds, either from water vapor or clouds of ash from the volcanoes, many, many volcanoes. So the land masses have cooled off greatly. So when the winds blow this warm, moisture-laden air over the cold land masses, you get tremendous amount of precipitation. In the northern latitudes, extreme north and southern latitudes, you get snow. It packs down over ice, and that's the mechanism for the ice age. The one and only ice age, not 30 as the evolutionists are telling us currently. It used to be 4 when I was in school. Now they've added 26. So, and also the Earth has aged several billion years since I was in school too, and I'm not that old. So here you see in pictorial form that the idea of that it's calculated the average ocean temperature is somewhere around 30 degrees centigrade, and then it cooled down to modern temperatures around 5 degrees. And around 500 years after the flood would be when the peak of the ice pack, the glaciation, and then after that, sun started coming out. So you see the representation at the very top where it's cloudy, and then it starts to clear up. There's still some volcanic activity, but it's not as severe as it had been. Sun's coming out, and eventually by 500 years, there's enough melting where there's a reversal of the ice age, and then after about another 200 years, it reaches its low point, and then ice gradually starts building up in Greenland, especially Greenland, and even Antarctica. You know, in spite of all what we're told about global warming by Al Gore and his friends, that there's more ice now in Antarctica than there had been. It's increasing there. Even though the Arctic is losing ice, the Antarctic is gaining ice. So you can see here a representation of the ice volume peaking at about 500 years and then reaching its low point at 700 and gradually increasing since. So this combination of the changes with all this tremendous amount of water being sucked out of the oceans by evaporation would lead to a drop of, I've heard both 300 and 400 feet, I've read both numbers in the literature, in the ocean level below what it is today, exposing a tremendously greater amount of ocean bottom as dry surface area during this 500-year period of the ice age, and that it would be so easy then for the people and for the animals then to migrate from the Near East, wherever the Ark landed in the Near East. There's debate about that. Across the land bridge in Siberia, and then, or I should say in Beringia, the Bering Sea, Bering Strait, and then down into the Americas, but not only there, but in other parts of the world as well. With that drop in sea level, you can see how most of the islands in the Caribbean would then be accessible from the mainland, and even in Southeast Asia, that pretty much everything is connected down to Australia. So not a problem for animals and people to migrate to just about everywhere during that time. And then after, with the reversal then of the ice age, and then at 700 years reaching conditions pretty much like today, you end up with this tremendous amount of ice up in the far north and the far south and on the highest mountain ranges. And you end up with these very warm tropical zones that are much hotter after the flood than pre-flood. Tremendous luxuriant growth with all the water and the warm temperatures. But then you end up with this situation of where we live in Cave Creek. This is actually literally outside of our front door here, where we have a desert where it's pretty doggone dry. But I gotta tell you, I love the lack of humidity. It's nice. And as they say, but it's a dry heat, you know. And so that's why we have this situation here. You live in your swimming pool, or you're in your air-conditioned car, or your air-conditioned office building, or your air-conditioned home, and everything's fine until the air conditioning goes out. And then my wife says, "Get me to California." So the question is, why do we have the desert at Phoenix, which is 32 degrees north? Well, that's because of these prevailing winds on a planetary scale, that at 30 degrees north of the equator and 30 degrees south of the equator is where the bands of the deserts of the world are found. So that's because of these prevailing patterns and the way the winds dump water in the tropics and suck water out of the air over the what are now desert regions. And we know this was not always the case in the post-flood world, because with these satellite imaging using other wavelengths than visible light, they can see that under the Sahara there used to be many river streams and beds, and that it was a much more luxuriant region in the Sahara in the past than it is today, for example. So all this to say that with these changes after the flood, triggered by the ice age after the flood, that led to the development of this wide diversity of environments that we have, whether it be hot, cold, dry, wet, and combinations of those things, along with winds being, with local changes in winds due to mountain ranges, changes due to elevation. So put all these various elements together and you get these wide range of environments that we have today that the animals and the plants take advantage of with the programmed filling of their genes, the genomes, being able then, with the various combination of genes, to fill all these various niches in the environment, leading to speciation. And so that's how we get from the wolf, the domestic dog. And I'm not going to tell you again, clean up your room, right? So whether it's people or the wolf, it's the same problem here. Okay, here's a quote for you. Dogs seem to share more genetic similarity with Middle Eastern gray wolves than with any other wolf population worldwide, said Robert Wayne, UCLA professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and senior author of the Nature paper from the journal Nature. Genome-wide analysis now directly suggests a Middle East origin for modern dogs. We have found that a dominant proportion of modern dogs' ancestry derives from Middle Eastern wolves, and this finding is consistent with the hypothesis that dogs originated in the Middle East. This is the same area where domestic cats and many of our livestock originated and where agriculture first developed. Is that not amazing from a secular journal? It's like, geez, maybe someone read those first 11 chapters of Genesis, possibly. So it's fantastic. Corroboration. I don't use the word proof, but I think confirmation is a good word to use. That science properly noted and interpreted does confirm Scripture. So I want to give you a contrast here between the two ways of looking at things, the evolutionary on the left and creation model on the right. And there's 4 points. These are 4 take-home points that I hope you leave with these things tattooed inside your skull. Because these are just so perfectly sum up what is very important to take away here. The evolutionary model says from a very small gene pool, from that first bit of life that started somewhere, and that's a whole nother lecture, increases due to mutations and selection. Again, they're saying the mutations add information, until change from one kind into a totally different kind by gain of information. That is the mantra that the evolutionists give us. That's their scenario. However, what we observe in real life, and what the Bible tells us, is from a very large gene pool that created kinds originally, and those on the ark, which divides by migration and selection, but I would rather say it's programmed filling, until changes occur within a kind, speciation within a kind, within the horse kind, within the cow kind, within the dog kind, within the cat kind, within the bear kind, by loss of information. So it's quite the opposite of what we're told by the evolutionists. How many of you have heard of Richard Dawkins, retired professor? Okay, great, almost all of you. Retired professor of zoology at Oxford University, who has become the most prominent spokesman in the English-speaking world for evolution, and he's become a virulent anti-Christian. Very virulent, if you've read or heard about his book, The God Delusion, for example. But that's not the only one of his books that is that way. Well, he was interviewed, and he was asked a question. Pay very careful attention to his answer.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Did you catch his answer? Do you want me to play that for you again in case you missed it? He has no answer. There is no answer to that question other than it didn't happen. Okay, is that not amazing? There simply is no way that evolution adds information. And so he could not honestly say yes. So who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, and whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind? All right, that was the main talk. Now, if you guys want, I've got about, well, maybe 15, maybe 20 minutes more of the special add-on dessert. Yes? All right, you're a good group. All right, and this fits so well with what we've just done. And this is about a very fascinating experiment that is still ongoing of domestication of foxes. About 100 years ago, Russians started farming foxes for the fur trade. And so for 50-some years, there already were foxes that had some contact, mainly of just being fed by people. Nothing was done to try to tame them or train them or anything like that. And then, in 1959, Dmitry Konstantinovich Belyaev, biologist, took on the task of seeing if he could get foxes to breed year-around so that the fox breeding industry could make lots more furs. Because the wild animals only breed on a seasonal basis. And most often, in mammals anyway, it's in the spring when the days started getting longer. That's the signal for them to start breeding. And so he undertook this research, which he started in 1959 and is still ongoing today, the same project. Now, it's because some very interesting things were added as he went along. The location for this work is here at Novosibirsk in the middle of Siberia, where lots of fur-bearing animals are found naturally. And he worked with the fox, Vulpes vulpes, the red fox, but it has color variations in that very same species. And that includes what's called the silver fox. It's the same species, just a different color variation. And the silver fox's fur, and this is what the farms, fox farms were dealing with, is the silver fox. And so he bought something like 128 or so, some thereabouts, of these silver foxes from the fox farms. And instead of their fate going to become this, he started breeding them for tameness. Well, it's known that it's not always beast eat beast, because in the Sriracha Zoo in Thailand, they've done some interesting stuff where you can see here that a mother tiger is breastfeeding piglets and a mother pig is breastfeeding, I guess you say cubs. Okay, and so what he did was he selected these foxes for tameness, and also a parallel population was selected for aggressiveness. And the means of selection was by simply taking the response of the beast. There was a team of two. One person would either try to touch or pet the fox or offer it food through the hand, from the hand. And then the observer would record the fox's reaction to this interaction. And if the fox gave a more tame type response, then that animal was selected then to be bred and combined with others that were indicating more tameness with each other to see if they could get an actual domesticated fox. And again, the original purpose was so that these things could be bred year-round, because it's noted that domestic animals breed year-round, wild animals only breed seasonally. So there was an economic motive for this experiment. So what they did in evaluating how much of this development of tameness was due to genetics and how much of it was due to other factors than genetics was they crossbred both groups, the very aggressive group and the very tame group. Not only that, they would take the newborns, the kits, and switch which mother fed them. So the aggressive mothers would be feeding some of the tamer kits, and the tamer mothers would feed breastfeed the more aggressive kits. They even went so far as to transfer embryos from uterus to uterus for the two different groups. So they did everything they could to try and evaluate the genetic component of the tameness, and they came up with a figure, and I don't know the calculations, but they felt that the genetic component to this was about 35%, and 65% of the tame behavior was due to the other factors than genetics. They even were able to do some work here showing that by the 6th generation there was such a change in the behavior that the foxes started seeking human contact like a dog, like a domestic dog, just by 6 generations. Amazing. They were amazed that it happened so quickly, blown away. And later on we'll look at the other changes that occurred in behavior along with that. And they were able to isolate that this genetic component was located on chromosome number 12, canine chromosome number 12. They have yet to locate it to this a-specific gene locus, gene location, but they know at least what chromosome it's on now. So very interesting stuff being done in a wide range of disciplines. Well, they did a lot of work with neuroendocrine. This refers to the combination of the nervous system and the endocrine system, and that combination meets especially in the brain, in the part of the brain that's towards the front and at the bottom of the brain, called the hypothalamus. I hope you biology students remember your hypothalamus. Yes? No? Maybe? Sort of? Yes, I see some head shaking. All right. Hypothalamus is where many hormones are secreted and then sent through the bloodstream to other parts of the body to do what they're supposed to do. By the 10th generation, year-round breeding was established. So the original purpose had been fulfilled in just 10 generations. But they said, wow, there is so much stuff going on here, we need to continue this investigation and see why this is happening. By the 45th generation, serum cortisol levels were 3 to 5 times lower in stress and non-stress situations. Well, what are cortisol levels? Cortisol is a hormone that mammals all have that helps regulate our blood sugar levels. And so that's why when you're stressed, your body puts out more cortisol to raise your sugar levels so that you have more fuel for your muscles to do things. Okay? So that's what cortisol levels are about. But the very interesting thing they found was that in the tamer population, even when stressed, that the cortisol levels in that tamer population were 3 to 5 times lower than in the ones who were not selected for tameness, the regular farm fox population. They also noticed that another kind of hormone chemical messenger called serotonin that had levels that were increased. And it's known that the serotonin levels, and these are in the brain itself, not affecting the other parts of the body, but in the brain itself, inhibit aggressiveness. Well, this is very interesting because in people who have some types of mental disorders are put on medications that inhibit the enzymes that break down serotonin. And so that the serotonin levels are higher, and then these people have evening out of their mental difficulties and have a much better quality of life. So there's real clinical, practical application to this. And then something called pro-opiomelanocortin. Pro-opiomelanocortin levels decreased. Okay, well, what does that have to do? Here we are. Here is a picture of the pituitary, which is just below the hypothalamus in the front lower part of the brain. And we'll go through this axis, this cascade. There's a thing called corticotropin-releasing hormone, known by CRH, This is secreted in the hypothalamus, the brain itself, and it goes through a very special set of capillaries to the anterior part of the pituitary gland. When it gets there, that releasing hormone causes the release of this thing called pro-opiomelanocortin. And you're saying, why did he put these crazy colors in here? Well, that's because depending upon the way this molecule gets sliced and diced, it forms very different hormones. I should say similar hormones in structure, but very different effects. So, for example, the opioid part is what ends up with beta endorphins. Maybe you've heard of beta endorphins. These are natural opiates that the brain makes. Anybody here is a runner, long distance runner? Anybody? What effect do you get when you've been running a long time? You get this kind of a high feeling, right? They call it the runner's high. That's because that's the effect. Your brain is putting out this pro-opiomelanocortin, and it gets sliced to make these beta endorphins, and that's how you get that runner's high. See? The melano is put in a dark color because that's the part that becomes melanocyte stimulating hormone, and that's what leads to increase of your pigmentation in your skin so that you can get a great tan. Okay? The cortin part is when that gets sliced off, that's the part that leads to cortisol through this intermediate step called adrenocorticotropic hormone. It makes this hormone, which is then liberated, sent into the bloodstream, and then leads to cortisol, which is produced by the adrenal gland, which sits on top of your kidneys. Is this not amazing stuff, how complicated the Lord has made us? Doesn't this blow your mind away? You know, it's a great time to be a Bible-believing scientist, Bible-believing Christian, a Bible-believing Christian who's a scientist. You've got to be careful how you word that, right? You don't want to say, well, okay, never mind. Because the more we learn, the more we see just how incredibly intricate all this has to be created. Could not have been a randomly evolved situation. So that's how we get to cortisol levels, is through this whole cascade here. Well, what this shows is combining the data here showing, and it's very pale. I don't know if you can really see it because these images were not the originals. But up here, there's these levels that are quite high, much higher than these. And the ones that were much higher were the farm fox population. Their cortisol levels and all these hormone levels were much higher than the foxes that were selected for tameness, the domesticated foxes. And this correlated with much calmer activity, much calmer attitude, and the tameness. So they found that with this reduction in cortisol was the reduction in the aggression, the reduction in the wild behavior, and the domestication of these foxes with this drop in cortisol levels. This is amazing because you have to remember, all of this information that they learned was simply because these animals were chosen for behavior, only for behavior, not for any physical traits. That's the thing that should blow the mind. Well, what about developmental changes? In other words, how an animal develops as it ages. Well, it's known that social bonds in canines and dogs form from the time their eyes open and the time that they start responding to sound stimulus until they start responding to unknown stimuli with fear. There's a window between the onset of being able to respond to sound and open their eyes to when they begin responding to an unknown stimulus in a fearful manner. And in that window is when social bonds with people occur in dogs. Well, the same thing is true in foxes. And so they noticed that as they went through these generations that the experimental foxes opened their eyes on days 17 and 18. The farm-bred foxes opened their eyes on days 18, 19. The experimental domesticated foxes responded to sound on day 14. The farm-bred foxes on day 16. The experimental domesticated foxes developed fear not until week 9, whereas the farm-bred foxes, week 6, much earlier. So there's a much narrower window for socialization in the farm-bred foxes than in the experimental domesticated foxes. Much longer window for domestication, for socialization, developing those social bonds, for having that tameness, for not having the aggressive behavior. And here shows the correlation with the cortisol levels. The farm-bred foxes had the highest levels, and then the experimental foxes had the lowest levels, and they were divided into those that had a low domestication score, and the ones that had the higher domestication score had the very lowest cortisol levels. Well, even in pregnancy, they noticed that there was a difference in the mothers, that in the pregnant ones, there were lower cortisol levels. And during breastfeeding, lower cortisol levels as well. So all through this, in reproductive changes, lower cortisol levels. Very interesting. And in the domesticated foxes, they developed sexual maturity 1 month earlier than the farm-bred foxes, in addition to losing that seasonality and being able to reproduce year-around. And they had an additional pup per litter. So as I mentioned, the selection was based on response to touch or pet or hand feeding. That was their criteria. And so you can see here the difference with the aggressive response in the top part of the photo and this wanting human contact being held in the lower photo. Rather amazing. And in more recent photos, as time went on, and experiment went on for these 50 plus years since then. Just amazing. Just like a regular dog. Well, other things showed up too, which really blew the minds of the investigators. The foxes developed an uplifted tail curling forward, just like this Iceland's Fairhund. Not only that, elongation of the lower jaw. Isn't that bulldog beautiful? Widening of the facial bones and ear floppiness. Remember that that's a fox on the right-hand side there. Isn't that amazing? And look at that floppy ears. Very rare in the wild foxes and the farm-bred foxes. Elongation of facial bones, not just the lower jaw. And look at the coat depigmentation. Loss of pigmentation. Well, where did that come from? That goes back to that long word, that pro-opio-melanocortin I mentioned. The melano part refers to the pigment cells. Delay in those pigment cells developing with those lower levels of the hormone. It's all tied together. Isn't it amazing? These physiologic changes due to just selecting for behavior. I mean, that should just blow your minds totally. So they call this the white star mutation. White star referring to the loss of pigment. Okay, that is a fox there. Okay, it doesn't look like it, but it is. So you get all these white patches going down the lower jaw, the chest, the belly. And here's something that's fascinating, is when the gene is inherited from the female, it's expressed much more often than when it's inherited from the male. And this concept of a difference into which parent the gene comes from and the effect is called genomic imprinting. In people, we know this to occur. It occurs in all sorts of animals, but example I know of medically is that this genomic imprinting in people is when the gene is expressed from the mother, it affects the development of the embryo, the human embryo, but when the gene is expressed from the father, it affects the development of the placenta. This is genomic imprinting. Okay, so the same factor is going on here with this depigmentation, that when the gene is inherited from the mother, much greater degree of depigmentation, much more frequent occurrence of depigmentation. And so you see this term here, an epigenetic factor. This means it's a factor not coming from a change in the genes themselves, not coming from a change in the sequence of the DNA. It's an epi meaning above, over. It's a change coming from something outside of the actual DNA. And that's because genes can be turned on and turned off by what happens outside of the chromosomes. And here's how it can happen. Okay, transcription means writing across. It means being able to develop the RNA from the DNA. developing the RNA from the DNA, the messenger RNA from the DNA. Well, whether or not that messenger RNA gets expressed, whether it's actually translated into protein production, can be happening or not happening depending upon whether, like for example here, a methyl group is attached to the DNA, a CH3, a methyl group. If that gets attached to the DNA, it's put on top of the DNA, it's an epigenetic change. That can turn a gene on or off. Same thing with a phosphate group and acetyl group. If these things get added on top of a gene, it can turn the gene on or off. So these are how epigenetic changes are accomplished without changing the genes themselves, without changing the DNA itself. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Okay, but this shows how there's unbelievable variation in what can happen, and it's got nothing to do with evolution. Nothing whatsoever. And there's the methyl group there that can be added to. All right. This one just shows that with the presence of these groups, these various groups I just mentioned, whether this transcription, this writing across, meaning the production of protein, eventual production of protein from the DNA, from the messenger RNA, happens or doesn't happen. And so that's how they think that's got to do with why we get this depigmentation in these tame foxes. And it's all because of behavior change. It's amazing, absolutely amazing stuff. All right, so here we see these various characteristics that are common to all domesticated animals. Increased variation in size. Okay, remember I told you, back to the horses, from the very large to that horse that's smaller than the 1 or 2 year old kid. Same thing from the bull mastiff down to the chihuahua. Okay, all this stuff can happen in these domesticated animals. And you see here this list: chickens, dogs, pigs, cattle, sheep, goats. The floppy ears, dogs, cats, sheep. The depigmentation, the white spotting, all of them, all domestic animals. The increased variation in hair coat, meaning like waviness or curliness of the hair, fur, in all these types of animals: sheeps, poodles, donkeys, horses, pigs, goats, mice, guinea pigs. Shortened tail, fewer vertebrae. How's that for a big change? Dogs, cats, and sheep. And reproductive changes in all of them, because they all can reproduce year-round and not seasonally. So think of all of these changes that happen in all of these different kinds of domesticated animals, and they all would have to take the same pathway by these random mutations, by chance events, if this was all due to Darwinian change. That's incredible. I mean, how can you believe that? That so many different animals, unrelated to each other, would all develop the same pathway by random chance events. It's crazy. And that's this challenge, is that all of these neuroendocrine and genetic changes that occur, that show up due to just strictly selecting for tameness and not for physical features. And how could all these multiple species do this? By natural selection, random chance events over millions of years. It's just not possible. Okay, so the dog is talking to the soon-to-be former mistress. And the dog says, well, they finally came, but before I go, let's see you roll over a couple times and answer questions. All right, I won't roll over, but I'll try and answer questions. You're tired. Yes, sir.
Your graph showed that axis of, with just looking at cortisol.
Right.
And then you showed all these incredible changes in the physical characteristics of the fox, the domesticated fox.
Right.
So do you think that's all due to the cortisol, or are there other things, other hormonal changes, other things happening to you that they just didn't look at and analyze?
I would say that the cortisol has got to be a main driving factor in that. You can't say that it's the only one, because there's probably other stuff going on there that they had no clue to investigate. But you can see that there is a mechanism for that through this pro-opioid melanocortin thing being a very, to make a bad pun, black and white explanation of why the depigmentation occurs itself. But all these other changes, and I mean, there's other hormonal changes going on as well that would affect
like the structural change.
Right. Yeah. See, growth hormone is part of all this as well, and so growth hormone would be affected. Okay. Now you got to remember that when some of these earlier parts of this study, they didn't know a fraction of stuff that we know today to even know that existed to look for it in the earlier parts of the study. And some of these things have been added on with time as the study has gone on over now 54 years. I mean, this is an amazing, amazing thing to happen like this. And to me, it's even more amazing that the funding for this had continued even with the fall of the communist regime and the new government having its financial difficulties, and they've still managed to keep this going. That's a real commitment.
So do they have, people have pet foxes now, or?
There are actually, you can go on the internet and adopt a domesticated fox. Yeah, you can. It's crazy, but yes, you can. Yeah. I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Could it be that a lot of the, this clustering of these various characteristics is due to linkage blocks? That, the tameness is on a linkage block with all these other characteristics, and when that characteristic is selected for, that everything else on the linkage block is also selected for?
I think they'll be able to better answer that question when they're able to identify the actual location, the locus of a particular gene, and then see how that is located in relationship to other genes that are in play here. But they haven't gotten that far yet. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yes, sir.
Just in fairness to the video clip, you had the gentleman that was trying to answer the question, do we have any mutation that would add to the, how did that clip play out? You showed him when he didn't answer. Did he ever respond to the question?
Oh, it was stopped because he said, stop the camera.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Dawkins, yeah, he said, stop the camera. And he had to compose himself before the interview continued. Yeah,
Can I say more about that?
please.
When he did continue, he answered a different question. He never went back to the original question.
Yeah, he had no answer for that whatsoever. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
How do you think an evolutionist would respond to these studies?
Well, evolution is a marvelous thing because it's so plastic. You can change it however you want to deal with anything you want to. As a matter of fact, the Russians themselves have come up with a term, and I wish I could remember it now, but they have a term that they use that nobody else in the world uses yet, to try and say that this is selection for variety. That's the gist of the term that they use, selection for variety. So you just simply come up with something to explain it away, which is what they always do. So that's all they can do. Yes, sir.
Is it correct to say that natural selection creates or leads to speciation?
Well, the better way to say it is that instead of giving the power to the environment to choose, it's that the power was given by the Lord through the genome, having all of the variety built into the genome, so that with the shuffling of the genes through reproduction, sexual reproduction, that whichever animal has the optimal combination of genes will then fill that environment. And that's why Dr. Galiuzza uses the term programmed filling, to put the power into the creator through the genome.
One has to have a designer, the other has to have random chance.
Yes.
I remember learning about kingdom, phylum, class, or family, genus, species, but I don't remember domain.
Right, that's relatively new. That's been in the last 20, 30 years. When they start using it, but it doesn't get into the textbooks until later. Domain, it's a higher level than kingdom. There are 3 domains, and one of them is for all of the bacteria, and the other one is called archaea. And both of those are the type of organisms, they're all unicellular organisms that are called prokaryotes. They don't have membranes around the nuclei or the organelles. But there are things within the archaea that separate them from the bacteria. And some features of the archaea are actually more like the eukaryotes, the cells that have membranes. And we are eukaryotes ourselves. And it's interesting, though, that most of the archaea are what they call extremophiles. These are the bacteria type things, archaea, that live in ice, that live in these hot springs at 132 degrees centigrade. 130 degrees centigrade. And live in these, they're even finding them 2 and 3 miles deep in the crust of the earth. Where they have these volcanic vents in the bottom of the oceans where hydrogen sulfide is coming up, hydrogen gas and hydrogen sulfide. Those chemicals are the energy source for the archaea that live down there. And that is the basis for the food chain, where you have those giant tube worms that you see the pictures of with the red tips on them. Okay, so the energy is captured from the chemicals by these archaea, and then the other organisms higher up the food chain convert them into, the different kinds of crabs, the worms and things that live in those areas. So those are archaea.
Are eukaryotes the third domain then?
Eukaryotes are the third domain, and that's the organisms that have membranes around the nuclei, around the organelles. So that would be all of the multicellular organisms and some unicellular organisms. Certain types of algae are the eukaryotes.
Why wouldn't all of those fit within either animal or plant?
Okay, the subdivisions of the eukaryotes are animals, plants, fungi, something called protists. And protists are the new term for what we used to call protozoa, the one-celled animals. But that protozoa meaning first life, but that name came from evolutionary bias. Okay, so protozoa has been changed to protists, and there's multiple kingdoms of protists within the domain eukarya. Okay. And they keep changing this all the time as they find more and more. The original classifications were due to structural features that we could see either with the naked eye or with the microscope, physical features. The new changes are coming about because of all the molecular studies, the DNA sequences, the protein sequences, amino acid, the RNA sequences. So they're looking at these things from the molecular viewpoint and reshuffling a lot of this. But the thing that's so great for creationists is the trees that are put together based on, let's say, DNA structures versus the trees put together by protein structures versus the trees that are put together by RNA structures versus the trees that are put together by physical anatomical structures, none of them agree with each other. And so the phrase you keep coming across time after time after time after time in the literature is the relationships among these factors have yet to be elucidated, or agreement has not yet been reached, etc., all those kinds of phrases. In other words, it isn't going to happen. We know why. Great question. And so this every so often, it's a great reason to give the publishers an excuse to make new textbooks or someone to publish new papers, is because they can find new stuff to reshuffle this stuff. Something to do, Yeah.
Yes, this says foxes in the experiment look so much like dogs. Has anyone tried breeding them with dogs?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what to tell you. I would think there would probably some success would be reached. Who knows? Maybe they're working on that. Wouldn't get much of a fur coat out of that one, though, would you? Anything else? Well, you guys have been great. Fantastic questions, and what a great group. Thank you very much.